So this first session is just a very quick overview of climate budget tagging. And what I'd like to do is cover just 4 topics. First of all, just a little bit of background. What exactly is climate budget tagging and who is doing it? Is it something which is kind of a rare thing done by 1 or 2 countries, or is it something more widespread? Then, of course, the all-important question of why on earth undertake this exercise, why go to the trouble of doing this exercise, and to really discuss 4 key reasons that countries have learnt of some of the benefits of undertaking climate budget tagging. Then a bit of an overview on the steps that need to be followed in relation to climate budget tagging. And then finally, a little bit of a discussion on what some of the experience suggests are some of the critical success factors if you want to implement climate budget tagging and deliver the benefits that we hope that it will achieve. So moving straight on to kind of what is climate budget tagging, I think it's in some sense, it's an exceptionally simple exercise. Because all it involves doing is identifying, measuring, and then monitoring the amount of public expenditure which is being spent on climate change. And in some sense, that sounds like a very simple exercise and something which shouldn't be too difficult. But of course, it is quite a lot more challenging and complicated than that. And the main reason that it is quite a lot more complicated and challenging than that is because climate change and the response to climate change is so cross-cutting. Whilst we have many representatives here from ministries who have the kind of the lead for climate change within their country, it is inevitable that climate change response has to be economy-wide and is inevitably cross-sectoral, covering the energy sector, the agriculture sector, the industry sector, the water resources sector. All of these sectors have a role to play in addressing climate change, either from a mitigation perspective or from an adaptation perspective. And therefore, inevitably, spending on climate change-related priorities sits across multiple different sectors and multiple different ministries. And if we want to try and consolidate and understand the amount of spending which is happening on climate change, then we have to find a way which allows us to identify expenditures in a way that cuts across multiple different ministries. So in terms of those 3 key steps, those 3 key words of identify, measure, and monitor, first of all, in order to identify expenditures, we need to have an understanding of what can be considered climate relevant. And as we'll come on to talk about, that is actually sometimes quite a challenging issue. There are some activities which are very clearly climate relevant, and then there are other activities where it's more subjective. It's more a question of judgment, and there's a need for expertise in order to actually make that decision and successfully identify climate-related expenditures. Once we've identified those expenditures, we then need to measure those expenditures. And what we'll learn on, what we'll talk about over the course of these 2 days, is that actually what we tend to do is we tend to make a judgment about not just whether or not an expenditure is climate relevant, but exactly how climate relevant it is. And trying to take account of the fact that some things are much more obviously climate relevant than other things. But in turn, if we want to do that judgment of how relevant an expenditure is, we then have to have some sort of criteria for applying the weights that would allow us to make that judgment. So we might say that something is very relevant and give it a very high weight, and something else is a bit less relevant and give it a lower weight. But we then need to have some criteria, some means of guiding our decision-making process for saying how relevant that is, if we are then going to succeed in measuring these expenditures. And then our final step in the definition of climate budget tagging is to actually monitor these expenditures. So to track them over time and to report on that tracking, and to report that to a wide range of different stakeholders so that that information can actually be used and inform decisions. It's no good just creating this information and then leaving it to sit in a report and never be used. A successful climate budget tagging exercise actually makes use of the data and monitors how it's changing over time and uses that information to make judgments about how to take forward activities. So that's what climate budget tagging is. Just a little bit of a reflection on where climate budget tagging is being applied. Hopefully you can see from this map that there are an increasing number of countries around the world which are applying climate budget tagging. And I think there are perhaps three things that I would draw your attention to. The first is that this is a international experience. We have countries across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe, all of which are applying climate budget tagging. This is not the preserve of just certain countries in certain parts of the world. Secondly, we can see that actually a number of the countries which are applying climate budget tagging, or at least the pioneers that apply climate budget tagging first, are generally speaking some of them considered to be some of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. So you'll see over here, especially in Asia, there was a big push on climate budget tagging among countries like Nepal and Bangladesh and Indonesia, all of which are recognized as being exceptionally climate vulnerable alongside the Philippines as well. And so this is an activity which has been inspired and led by countries that are recognizing the threats that climate change poses to their national economies and to their way of life. But whilst climate budget tagging might have started in some of these most vulnerable countries, actually what we're now seeing is this spread into developed countries as well. It's no longer the preserve of developing countries and an activity which is only being done by developing countries in conjunction with development partners. We now see that a number of developed countries, including France and including the Republic of Ireland and including the EU, are all applying a form of climate budget tagging and using that to inform their decisions around how to tackle climate change. So this is really becoming an international and experiences that is cutting across both developed and developing countries. So that's a little bit of experience on climate budget tagging and where it's being undertaken. I thought it would also be helpful just to explain the context of climate budget tagging in the context of climate public expenditure and institutional reviews, CPEIRs, because certainly when I first moved into this area of work, I found some of the distinction between CPEIRs and in climate budget tagging and kind of how they relate to each other as a little bit confusing. So I think the way that I tend to think about it is that a CPER is often the entry point into undertaking climate budget tagging. So what a CPEIR is it's a diagnostic tool which looks back at recent historic performance and asks to what extent climate change is being integrated into public financial management, PFM processes. And to do that, it looks at three different activities or three different pillars. It looks at policy analysis and to what extent climate change policy is being embedded in the programs and objectives of the PFM and the budgetary process. It looks at the institutional processes around public financial management and the extent to which they embed climate budget tagging. And then it looks at the expenditure analysis and tries to do an historic assessment of what money has been spent on climate in the recent past. And what we tend to find is that a lot of countries, having undertaken this CPEIR, decide that actually they've learned an awful lot of information and got a lot of value out of the CPEIR, and therefore decide to undertake climate budget tagging on a forward-looking, regular basis because of what they have learned from the CPEIR. And in particular, what they tend to use the approach that has been identified in the expenditure analysis, which has been this kind of backward-looking assessment of how much budget has been allocated to addressing climate change. There's been a lot of analytical work which is done to undertake that assessment. And what they tend to say, what they tend to decide is, okay, now we have done this, undertaken this analytical work, we've made all these difficult decisions about how to decide how much budget is being allocated to address climate change. Let's not just do that as a one-off exercise as part of the CPEIR. Let's use that information, let's use that approach and actually embed that into our forward-looking decisions over budget and our forward-looking decisions about how we monitor the budget and how much is being used how much money within the budget is being allocated to climate change. So the CPEIR looks backwards, and as a result of what is learned from the CPEIR, there's often a decision moving forward to integrate climate budget tagging into the budget, using some of the tools and the analytical techniques that are developed as part of the expenditure component of the CPEIR. So that's the kind of the relationship between climate budget tagging and CPEIRs. What I'd like to just spend a little bit of time talking about now is why on earth do this exercise? Why do countries spend the time and the effort to undertake climate budget tagging? Because as we'll see through the course of the workshop and the webinar, it does require resources, and it does require a commitment from a lot of different stakeholders. So what makes that commitment worthwhile? And I think there are 4 main groups of reasons for why countries have and continue to use climate budget tagging. Perhaps if we start in the top right here around improving climate strategy. I mean, this is kind of perhaps the most obvious one, and it's we have the old adage that you can't manage what you don't monitor, or you have to monitor what you want to manage. And that applies just as much to climate change and the public sector's response to climate change as it does to any other area of life. And so one of the main reasons for undertaking climate budget tagging is to provide information which allows countries to assess whether or not their climate strategy is on track. So they've developed their NDC, or they've developed their long-term strategy, or their low emission development strategy, or their adaptation strategy. And that's all well and good, but actually, if we're going to be confident that that strategy is going to be implemented, we need to know whether or not the money is being allocated in line with that strategy. And perhaps over time, we realize that not enough money is being allocated to one part of the climate strategy, and that perhaps a little bit too much is being allocated to another part of the strategy. If we didn't have climate budget tagging, it would be much, much more difficult to make those judgment calls, to course correct it as we implement the strategy, and therefore it would be much more likely that the strategy would go off track and wouldn't be implemented. So for me, one of the main reasons around introducing climate budget tracking is in order to improve the implementation of the climate strategy that a country has developed. The second reason, and it's an exceptionally important one, is using climate budget tagging to identify funding gaps and then raise finance accordingly. And perhaps the best example of that, the poster child for that, is probably the experience in Indonesia, where the Indonesian government was able to use the exercise, its climate budget tagging exercise, to say, look, at the moment, we're not spending anything like as much as we need to on these investment priorities that we have identified, we're going to have to increase the amount of spending on climate-related activities quite significantly. And these are the priorities that we have, because these are the areas which are relatively neglected at the moment. And then they use that information and that identification of priority areas to actually underpin the issuance of a sovereign green bond in the country. So the climate budget tagging exercise was deeply embedded in the strategy that was used for raising finance through a new green bond. And that has been successfully implemented, and the money has now been raised from that bond and is being put towards the purposes I intended. That's perhaps the most explicit example, but there are lots of other examples of countries using climate budget tagging to showcase what the good work that they are already doing on climate change to development partners, in order to strengthen the dialogue with those development partners, so that there can be a decision to further support climate-related activities into the future. And a number of countries, developing countries across the world, use that climate budget tagging information to demonstrate the commitments that they are already making, and to use it as a way of bolstering partnership with development partners moving forward. The third reason that countries can use it is to actually increase awareness and communication. Partly that is internationally, as I just mentioned, in relation to work with development partners, and also in national reports to the UNFCCC and other organizations. But a lot of it is also domestically. A lot of countries report that once line ministries and ministries of finance understand what climate budget tagging is and understand why they're doing it and why it's important, they actually begin to become much more aware of the importance of embedding climate change into the strategy of the line ministry and the expenditure plans of the line ministry. And people think a lot more about how they can take existing programs and make them more climate relevant. So it can be an extremely useful tool in raising awareness and around the challenges associated with climate change, and communicating that within and across government and wider stakeholders in the country. And then the fourth reason is nothing to do with climate change really whatsoever, and it's just really instead a key benefit can be that once we have a better understanding of how much money is being spent on climate-related activities and climate-relevant activities, then there becomes a desire to improve the public financial management of those expenditures, and to make sure that the money which is being allocated to climate-related activities is being spent wisely and efficiently, and is generating good value for money. And if you don't have the expenditure analysis in the first place, then you can't do that sort of that kind of improvement to the public financial management process. So we've often seen in previous climate budget tagging exercises that once people are tagging their climate budgets their budgets for climate change, they then realize that all this expenditure is being spent on climate-related activities, and actually they realize there aren't particularly good indicators for measuring the success of that spending, and therefore it creates a demand for better and improved and more indicators. And we have, as a consequence, we have an enhanced public financial management process, which allows us to spend scarce resources, scarce taxpayers' resources, as wisely and as sensibly as possible. So those are the four main reasons that I see for undertaking climate budget tagging. But obviously very keen to hear the experience, particularly of Moldova, but also of other countries who may see that they think there are additional benefits as well, which can be generated from climate budget tagging, not covered in that slide. If I push on now for just to reach the end of this presentation and then open it up for questions and discussion. The next stage I wanted to cover was really just a little bit about the important steps that need to be undertaken when delivering climate budget tagging. And I won't go into huge amounts of detail around this at the moment because some of this will be covered in subsequent sessions. But I think we can break it down into 3 main phases. First of all, there's a series of key issues around defining the purpose and the objectives and understanding the context in which climate budget tagging is being undertaken. Then there are a second phase of activities around the detailed technical design of climate budget tagging. And then there are a third set of issues around the details determining how precisely this tool is going to be implemented, what the different modalities are going to be, which organizations are going to be responsible and in which ways. So just taking those into each of those 3 areas in turn and digging into a tiny bit more detail. If we start with defining the purpose and the setting of the climate budget tagging exercise, so we're in the top box here. In turn, I think there are 3 key activities which need to be undertaken at this first stage. First of all, we have to define the objectives of a climate budget tagging exercise. That's not just an academic or theoretical exercise. We see in lots of different cases around the world that having clarity over what we're trying to achieve when we introduce climate budget tagging can make a really significant difference in how we tackle the design questions. There are quite a lot of different design questions or issues that need to be addressed as we develop a climate budget tagging process. And there are some difficult questions about, do we do X or do we do Y? Do we do A or do we do B? Unless you have a clear understanding of what the objectives are from a climate budget tagging exercise, it can be very difficult to make those judgment calls. But if you do have an understanding of what those objectives are, then it can become much easier to decide, okay, well, we want to design it in this particular way, or we want to design it in that particular way. And we'll pick up a few of those as we go through the workshop. The second phase, after we've decided what it is we want to use climate budget tagging for, is we then have to identify who are the key stakeholders are going to be involved in this process. And even here, we can begin to see that it's going to be really important to understand what the objectives are in order to define who those key stakeholders will be. So if the main objective is around raising external finance, then it's important to bring development partners into the process from the start so that they're fully aware of what it is that is being planned. If there's a stronger objective around raising public awareness, then it's going to be more important to bring parliamentary bodies into the discussion, and perhaps, depending on the structure of a particular country, also to bring local government and subnational governments into the decision-making process about how climate budget tagging is going to be implemented. What will remain the case throughout is that there will always be an important role for the Ministry of Finance. And then the third area in this first phase is really just to understand exactly what the current public financial management settings are in a country, because they will inevitably have an important role in defining what is possible and what is not going to be possible in relation to a climate budget tagging exercise. So we have to be aware of kind of what extent the budget is programmatic, it has clear objectives, and we have clear performance indicators around individual programs and actions. We have to understand what the chart of accounts currently looks like and whether or not that's going to make it nice and easy to introduce an extra tag, or whether or not it's kind of quite restrictive, and in which case we might need to take a more manual approach. We're going to have to look at the IFMS system and make sure to what extent can that be manipulated easily, so that if we did want to introduce an additional item into the chart of accounts, that would be relatively easy to do. And we also have to understand a little bit about how much the PFM system collects about state-owned enterprises and subnational government spending, because again, that depending on how much is currently collected in relation to those sorts of activities, then we will be able to make an informed judgment as to whether or not they should be part of the climate budget tagging exercise. So this third stage is really about context setting. The middle phase is then the design phase. And I definitely won't spend much time on this, because we'll have the whole of the next hour of the workshop focused on this. But this is going to cover issues around the coverage that needs to be the budget tagging exercise takes. It will cover issues about the level of granularity, kind of where do we make the decision about what activities are climate relevant. It was going to cover issues about how we define what is climate relevant and how we weight things. And it's going to cover issues about how we might want to categorize different climate relevant expenditures as well. So there's a lot to be covered here, and I'll unpack that hopefully in more detail in the next session. Once we have decided on how we're going to design and implement, kind of how we are going to design the climate budget tagging exercise, there are then kind of the important issues around implementation. And that's got a number of different aspects to it. Perhaps the three most important are: we need to assign organizational responsibilities. We need to decide if this is being led by the Ministry of Finance or by another organization. We need to decide whether or not it's going to be the Ministry of Finance which does the tagging, or whether it's going to be the line ministries that do the tagging. And we need to decide who is going to validate that decision. Is it going to be validated at all? Is it going to be validated by an external body? Who's going to be responsible for checking that the decisions over tagging has been done correctly? Then there are details about kind of the detailed implementation of a tagging procedure. Is it going to be done manually in spreadsheets, or is it going to be embedded into the IFMIS system? And when is it going to be undertaken? Is it going to be undertaken as line ministries are thinking about planning and preparing their budgets? In which case, so it could either be undertaken by line ministries when they're preparing their budgets, or it could be undertaken at the point when budgets are entered into the system. If we do it when line ministries are planning their budgets, then the benefit is that we can encourage line ministries to develop more climate sensitive budgets, and it will really hopefully influence their decision over how to design particular programs and how to make those programs as climate sensitive as possible. But if we leave it to individual line ministries, then there's a risk that different line ministries will interpret climate budget tagging in different ways, and that will lead to kind of inconsistencies in application. Whereas if we do it when we're actually entering it into the system, then we'll probably have greater scope for harmonization and consistency across different line ministries, but maybe the opportunity to influence decision making at the budget at the line ministry level will be missed. And then finally, there are some important issues which have to be decided around reporting formats. Is it going to be integrated within the mainstream financial reporting? Is it going to be a separate document which gives kind of more visibility to the exercising activities that is being spent on climate change? And some countries have decided, such as Nepal, I think, have decided that actually they use the information within their citizens' budget, so that the wider stakeholders of the public have a better understanding of what the government is doing in relation to climate change. And of course, there's no reason why those options can't be combined, but it very much depends, again, on which of those options you want to go for. Depends very much on what your objectives from climate budget tagging are. Very quickly, before I conclude this first session, we find from the literature that there are a number of different success factors which help determine whether or not climate budget tagging will be successful. What we definitely know is that it requires strong political leadership at the centre. As I mentioned before, climate budget tagging is inherently cross-sectoral, cross-ministerial. And if we want it to be a success, we know that it's going to have to be led with strong central leadership, almost certainly from the Ministry of Finance. But whilst it's imperative that the Ministry of Finance leads, we also need to make sure that line ministries are brought into the process and understand the benefits of the process. If this is just another compliance activity, something that the line ministries are doing because they've been told to do, then it's going to be neglected. It's not going to be information which is going to be inputted into the budget tagging exercise. It's going to be poor quality and people won't have thought about it very much. And then we're going to lose all of the benefits which are associated with climate budget tagging. So yes, led from the centre by the Ministry of Finance, but with a really strong concerted effort to bring line ministries into the process and to help them understand why it's of value for them to spend time doing this. Linked to that, and as I've emphasised, I hope quite a lot through this first presentation, it's really important to clarify the objectives of climate budget tagging up front. So that we can make those, when it comes to those difficult design questions, we can know which way we want to take those design questions based on the objectives that we've got. And then finally, the last three are all about trying to integrate climate budget tagging into wider government processes. So if we want climate budget tagging to be successful, then it can't just be a kind of an exercise which is done and then nobody ever uses it and the information which is generated is ignored. We want it to be sustained and we want it to be creating useful information so that people can actually value that information and realize why they need to spend the time doing it. So the greater we can design the climate budget tagging exercise so that it links into national climate policy objectives, the better. So the more that we can say, okay, this amount of spending is going towards this particular policy objective, and this amount of spending is going to that particular policy objective, the more people are going to see that it actually is relevant and producing useful information. Secondly, we need to make sure, or fifthly, but a second of these last three, we need to make sure that climate budget tagging and the information it creates is embedded within broader accountability mechanisms. If people are using this information to hold people to account, budget holders to account, then it will become apparent why the information is useful. So alongside climate budget tagging exercise, what we often see is that parliaments in particular assume a greater interest in understanding what is being spent on climate change and use the additional information to impose additional accountability on the executive. And that's whilst that's inevitably frustrating and annoying, a lot of time for people who are responsible for spending the money, it's actually a sign of the kind of the long-term success of climate budget tagging, because it shows that the information is being used and it shows why that people are getting value out of generating the information. And then finally, if we think about it in terms of line ministries and the executive, the government, again, the more that climate budget tagging information is actually used for subsequent planning, so that we can say, okay, we spent this amount this year, but perhaps we didn't spend enough on this particular activity, or we've realized that actually because of climate budget tagging, we need to spend more here or a bit less there, or this priority is being neglected. Again, that's essential for ensuring that the climate budget tagging remains relevant and that the exercise remains sustainable. So making sure that the loop is closed and that the information that is generated by the climate budget tagging exercise is actually used by line ministries and ministries of finance to actually inform future decisions and planning.